It was a Saturday when my brother called a family meeting. Not a text, not an email, an actual phone call, the kind he only made when he wanted an audience, the kind with that practiced pause before he spoke, like he was waiting for applause that hadn't started yet. Dad's estate. Sunday. 3 o'clock, everyone needs to be there. Then he hung up before I could say a word. I stood in my apartment kitchen, phone still warm in my hand, staring at the window above the sink. Outside, Chicago moved the way it always did, indifferent, loud, entirely unbothered by the Callahan family and whatever was about to happen in my mother's living room. My colleague Dana looked up from the couch where she'd been pretending to read. "You okay?" "Fine," I said. "Family thing." She gave me the look people give you when they know fine is doing a lot of heavy lifting. I put the phone in my pocket and went back to my coffee. Dad had been gone for 4 months. Heart attack, quick, no warning, no goodbye. He was the kind of man who built things quietly and let other people take credit for them. He built the company the same way. Callahan Materials, mid-size commercial real estate supply, based in Naperville. 30 years, steady growth, nothing flashy. The kind of business that didn't make headlines but kept 53 families employed and the lights on. He'd started it with $40,000 and a used truck. My brother had been running the day-to-day for the past 6 years. He had the title, the office, the business cards with VP stamped under his name. He gave the toasts at the client dinners. He shook the hands. He wore the suits well enough that most people assumed the whole thing was his idea. What nobody at Sunday's meeting would know, what nobody in my family knew, was that for the past 3 years I had been quietly buying shares. Not loudly. Not through the family attorney. Through a holding company registered in Delaware, through a broker my father's old friend had recommended before he retired, through paperwork that didn't have my name on the front page. Dad knew. He was the one who suggested it. He sat across from me at a diner in Oak Park the spring before he died, pushed a folder across the table, and said, "You're the one who understands what this company actually is. I want you to have a stake in it that nobody can argue with later." He knew my brother. He loved him the way fathers love difficult sons, deeply, carefully, always slightly braced. I didn't tell anyone. I kept going to my job at the architectural firm. I kept showing up to holidays and keeping things surface level and nodding when my brother talked about growth strategy at Thanksgiving like he was presenting at Davos. Nobody asked what I did with my money. Nobody asked much about me at all. I drove down to Naperville Sunday morning. The drive was 2 hours with traffic, and I spent most of it quiet, watching flat Illinois landscape scroll past. No music. I wasn't nervous. I just needed the silence to feel steady. Mom's house looked the same as always. Navy shutters, rose bushes along the front walk, the porch light she left on year-round because Dad always said it looked welcoming. I sat in the car for a moment before going in. I counted the cars already in the driveway. My brothers. Our aunt and uncle from Joliet. A rental with a Midway sticker. That would be our cousin Philip, who flew in for anything that involved money and called it family loyalty. I rang the doorbell. Mom answered. She looked tired in the careful way people look tired when they've been holding themselves together in front of others for months. She pulled me into a hug, and I felt her exhale a little against my shoulder. "He has papers," she whispered. "I don't understand all of it." I nodded. "It's okay." Inside, the living room had been rearranged. Not dramatically but noticeably, the armchairs pulled into a loose semicircle, the coffee table cleared, a folding table near the wall with printed documents stacked in labeled folders. My brother stood next to it, one hand resting on the top folder like it was a podium. He was wearing a blazer on a Sunday, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he'd rehearsed this. He looked at me when I walked in. His smile was the kind that meant the opposite. "Glad you made it," he said. "Of course," I said, and found a seat near the window. The room filled up quickly. Aunt Renee and Uncle Don settled in across from me. Cousin Philip dropped into the armchair closest to my brother like he'd been assigned to it. Mom sat on the couch, hands folded, already looking like she wished she were somewhere else. My brother's wife perched on the arm of Philip's chair, holding a glass of iced tea, watching the room the way people watch rooms when they already know the outcome. When everyone was seated, my brother cleared his throat. He thanked everyone for coming. He said he knew it was hard, losing Dad. He said he'd spent the last 4 months trying to understand what Dad would have wanted. He said he'd worked with the family attorney, Mr. Cont, Haskell, who was seated now in the corner with a leather portfolio on his knees and the expression of a man who had made peace with uncomfortable rooms to ensure everything was handled properly. Then he picked up the first folder. Dad's will, he said, was clear in its intention. The business was to remain in family hands, managed by whoever was best positioned to lead. He paused just long enough for that to settle. He said he didn't want to make this harder than it needed to be. He said he had been running the company for 6 years, and he intended to continue doing so. He looked around the room. No one objected. Mom looked at her hands. Then he picked up the second folder. "There's one other matter," he said. And his voice shifted, the same way a person's voice shifts when they've been waiting to say something for a very long time. He looked at me. "We recently became aware of some outside investment activity involving Callahan Materials. Shares that were acquired without proper disclosure to the board or the family." Aunt Renee turned her head slightly. Philip straightened. He opened the folder, turned it to face the room. Pages with corporate filings, transfer records, highlighted lines. He'd done his homework. Or rather, he paid someone to do it for him. "A Delaware holding company called Vantage Ridge LLC, he said, has been accumulating minority shares in Callahan Materials over the past 3 years. He looked at me again. "We've traced the beneficial ownership back to a single individual." He said my name. The room shifted. Not dramatically. No one gasped. It was more like a pressure change. The kind you feel in your ears when you go up in altitude. I sat still. He continued. "He said it was a violation of the family's trust. He said I had used a shell company to circumvent the family governance agreement. He said the shares were legally questionable, and he was prepared to challenge the acquisitions in court if necessary. He said he had consulted with Mr. Town, Haskell, extensively." Mr. Haskell crossed his ankles and looked at the floor. He said it quietly, but he said it fully. "I think it's best if you step back from any involvement in the company's future, for the sake of the family." The room sat with that for a moment. Philip nodded slowly, as if he'd been brought in as a neutral observer and had just reached a fair verdict. My aunt made a small sound. Mom's hands tightened in her lap. I looked at my brother. He was watching me the way people watch you when they've won something and they want to make sure you know it. I didn't speak. He took that as confirmation. He moved to the next folder, began talking about the transition plan. New board structure, consolidating ownership. His voice found its rhythm, the one he used in client meetings, smooth and reasonable and impossible to argue with if you didn't know what was underneath it. Mom finally looked up at me. Her eyes asked a question she didn't have the language for yet. I gave her nothing. Not because I was angry, I wasn't. I had been trained for this too. Just differently than I'd been trained for anything involving a building or a balance sheet. I had been trained by 3 years of watching and waiting and knowing that the moment someone shows you their hand, the right move is to let them finish the deal before you show yours. My brother kept talking. I kept counting. Here's what he did not know. Vantage Ridge LLC held 34% of Callahan Materials. My brother held 28%, distributed through the will. The remaining shares were split between a small original investor who had quietly exited 18 months ago and whose shares I had also acquired, and the family trust, which held 11%. The family trust, which my father had restructured the year before he died. The trust that named me as its administrator, 34% plus 11% is 45%. My brother held 28. Majority required 51. Neither of us had it alone. But here's what else he did not know, what nobody in that room knew except Mr. Haskell, who had been Dad's attorney for 22 years and who was currently sitting in the corner studying the carpet with great focus. 6 weeks before my father died, he had signed a proxy agreement. It designated the administrator of the family trust to exercise voting rights on his behalf in any shareholder decision until the trust was formally dissolved. He had signed it because he trusted me. He had not mentioned it to my brother because he knew my brother would find a reason to undo it. The proxy agreement was not in any of my brother's folders. He finished his presentation. He asked if there were any questions. Philip said he thought everything sounded reasonable. My aunt said she just wanted whatever was best for the family. Mom said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. My brother looked at me one more time. The look said, "Your move." I reached into my bag. I pulled out a single manila folder. Not a stack, not a binder, just one folder. Thin, plain, nothing written on the tab. I placed it on the coffee table without opening it. Everyone looked at it the way people look at something they suddenly aren't sure they want to know about. "I'd like to say a few things," I said. My voice came out even, which surprised no one more than me. I've been quiet this whole time because I wanted to understand exactly what was being said before I responded. I think that was the right call. My brother's jaw tightened slightly. I looked at Mr. Haskell first. I said his name. He looked up from the carpet for the first time since I'd arrived. I said, "I believe you were present when Dad signed the Vantage Ridge proxy extension in March." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The room didn't catch it. I did. I looked back at my brother. The acquisition of shares through Vantage Ridge was not a violation of the family governance agreement, I said. The governance agreement applies to direct transfers between family members and requires disclosure only when ownership crosses a threshold of 30% within a 12-month period. The acquisitions I made were structured specifically to remain under that threshold in each calendar year. I opened the folder. Inside was a single document, a legal opinion letter from a firm in Chicago. 3 years old. Dad's signature at the bottom authorizing the approach. I placed it on the table. "He knew," I said simply. The room got very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from shock. The kind that comes when people realize the story they were told had a different ending the whole time, and they're trying to figure out which parts they believed and why. My brother said, "That doesn't change the governance issue. It doesn't have to," I said. "Because the governance issue isn't actually the question in front of us. The question is who holds controlling interest. You've presented your shares. I've presented mine. If you'd like, Mr. Haskell can walk the room through the proxy agreement Dad signed before he died." I watched my brother's face do something complicated. Mr. Haskell uncrossed his ankles. He opened his portfolio. He was a careful man, the kind who didn't rush even when rooms were burning around him. He removed a document, 2 pages, placed it on the table beside mine. He cleared his throat. Said the date it was signed. Said what it authorized. Said who it named. My brother looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me. His voice, when it came, was very controlled, very quiet. "You knew about this the whole time." "Yes," I said, "and you just sat there." I said, "I wanted to hear what you had to say." The thing about moments like that is they don't arrive with music. No one applauds. The room just recalibrates. My aunt set down her glass. Philip looked at his phone like it might explain things. My brother's wife was very still. Mom was looking at me. Really looking the way she hadn't in a long time. Not because she'd been avoiding me, she had, a little, but because she hadn't realized there was this much of me to look at. My brother said, "I'd been running this company for 6 years. "I know," I said. "That should count for something." "It does," I said, "and I mean that. I'm not here to push you out. I'm here because Dad wanted me to make sure this company didn't get dismantled to satisfy a short-term plan." He looked at me. He knew you'd try to consolidate everything quickly. He wasn't angry about it. He just wanted a counterbalance. Something passed across my brother's face then. Not anger, that had already burned through. Something older than anger. Something closer to grief. He didn't say anything for a while. Philip finally spoke, because Philip always needed to fill silence with something. "So what does this mean practically?" "It means we talk," I said. "Like people who are actually trying to run a company and not just win an afternoon." My brother sat down. He'd been standing this whole time, and when he sat he looked less like a man in a blazer and more like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been told he didn't have to do it alone. It didn't make him happy exactly. but it made him smaller, and the way people get smaller when the performance is finally over. We stayed at Mom's for another 2 hours. Mr. Haskell walked through the legal framework. There were questions, some practical, some sharp, some the kind that were really just processing out loud. Mom asked more than anyone. Once she understood the shape of things, she asked why Dad hadn't just told everyone. I said he believed in giving people the chance to show who they were first. She looked at my brother when I said that. He was looking at the table. By the time people started leaving, the room had mostly settled, not resolved. Resolution takes longer than an afternoon, but the pressure had equalized. The thing that had been pretending to be one kind of meeting had revealed itself as a different kind, and everyone had adjusted accordingly. Philip hugged me on the way out, which I found baffling, but I let him. Aunt Renee squeezed my arm and said, "Your father would be proud." I said thank you and meant it, though I also knew she'd told my brother the same thing 6 months ago about something unrelated. Some people distribute pride like it's a renewable resource. My brother walked me to my car. He didn't say much. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the rose bushes, and finally said, "I didn't know he talked to you about this." "I know," I said. He nodded at the driveway. Did he think I couldn't handle it? I thought about that before I answered. I said, "I think he thought you could handle it better if you weren't doing it alone." My brother said nothing for a moment. Then, "I have been trying to hold everything together." "I know you have," I said, "and I mean that too." He looked at me, the look of a person who was deciding whether to accept something. He didn't get there all the way that afternoon, but he was closer than he'd been 3 hours ago. He went back inside. I got in my car. I didn't play music on the drive back either. Just rode, just the city lights starting to come up on the horizon, just the particular silence of something that had been held in suspension for a long time finally coming down. The company restructuring took 6 weeks, 3 board meetings, 2 sessions with Mr. Haskell, 1 afternoon that got loud and 2 that didn't. My brother and I agreed on a co-governance structure. Him running operations, me holding the strategic vote on major decisions, a neutral third party brought in for disputes. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about families and money ever is. But it was functional, and it was honest, and it was more than my father had dared hope for, I think. I went back to my job at the firm. I kept my apartment. I called Mom more than I had before, which wasn't a high bar, but still. She asked me once, a few months later, why I had never just told the family about the shares. We were on the phone, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, the soft sound of cabinet doors and the particular quiet of a house that had recently learned to hold one less person. I said, because telling people things before they've shown you who they are is a risk. And Dad taught me that the hard way. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he was the same way, you know. All those years building things nobody saw until they were already built. I know, I said. I learned it from him. She didn't say much after that. But the pause before she said goodnight was the kind that carried weight. The kind that meant she was adding something new to a picture she'd been looking at for years and hadn't fully seen. I didn't need her to say it. I'd stopped needing people to say the things they already knew a while ago. That's the thing about patience. Real patience. Not the performative kind. It's not about waiting for vindication. It's about knowing that the truth doesn't need your help. It just needs enough time. There was no dramatic ending, no press, no cameras, no cousin filming under the table. Just a family that finally had the honest conversation it had been avoiding, because one person had spent 3 years quietly making sure there was no other option. My father built things in silence, left them for other people to stand on. I think I understand now why he did it that way. Not because he wanted credit, because he wanted it to last. People often think that the loudest person in the room is the one with the most power. My brother believed that for a long time. He believed that showing up with folders and a blazer and a prepared speech was the same thing as being right, and for a while, in that living room, it looked like he was. What I've learned, not from that Sunday, but from the 3 years that built it, is that real strength doesn't announce itself. It prepares, it documents, it waits, and it doesn't need an audience to know its own worth. My father understood something that took me a long time to understand too. He knew that the people who build things quietly are often the ones who watch those things get taken by the people who speak loudly. So he didn't just leave me something. He left me a structure. A legal one, yes, but more than that, a philosophy. Do the work before anyone asks you to. Understand the thing more deeply than the person who thinks they own it, and when the moment comes, you won't need to raise your voice. The paperwork will do it for you. That's what I mean when I say this wasn't really about shares or proxy agreements, or who sits at the head of a boardroom table. It was about what happens when you choose patience over performance, every single day for years when no one is watching and no one is applauding. My brother had 6 years of visibility. I had 3 years of preparation. In the end, preparation didn't just match visibility. It outlasted it. There's a cause to every outcome in this life, even the ones that look like accidents. My brother didn't lose control of the company because he was unlucky. He lost it because he spent years assuming that the people around him were either with him or irrelevant. He never asked what I knew. He never wondered what I was building. He looked at me and saw someone who had left, and he stopped looking. That gap between what he assumed and what was actually true became exactly the space my father used to protect something he loved. I don't tell this story to celebrate winning. I tell it because I think there are people who are quietly doing the right thing right now, working, building, documenting, enduring, while someone louder takes up all the air in the room, and they need to know that what they're doing matters, even when it's invisible, especially when it's invisible. Intelligence isn't just what you know, it's knowing when to show it. Character isn't just what you do in the easy moments, it's what you hold on to when the room has turned against you and no one has said your name right in years. And persistence, real persistence, isn't stubbornness. It's the quiet decision made over and over again to keep building the thing worth building, regardless of who notices. My father built a company with $40,000 and a used truck. He didn't need recognition to keep going. He needed a reason. And he passed that down to me the same way he passed down everything else, not with a speech but with a signature on a document in a diner in the spring before anyone knew what it would mean. That's the inheritance that mattered, not the shares. The understanding of why patience, done with integrity, is the most powerful move in any room.